Welcome back, everyone. We are nearing the end of our program today. We have two more panel discussions, starting with this one. So, with the rise in fuel prices and the push for more sustainable practices in agriculture, we are going to discuss the future of renewable resources and how they impact food and agriculture. Given that this is so late in the afternoon, we're hoping an energy discussion will bring some energy to the room. You're welcome. Before we begin, we'd like to introduce our three panelists joining us here today. We have, let's go from left to right here. We have Kevin Johnston, Associate Counsel for the California Farm Bureau. We have Michael Boccadoro, the President of the West Coast Advisors, as well as the Executive Director of Dairy Cares. And we have Julee Malinowski-Ball, Partner of Public Policy Advocates. All right, I'm just going to start off with a little general question here for everybody. Kevin, I'll shoot it to you and we'll just bounce it down. How are the state's electrification goals impacting agriculture as far as utility rates and adopting renewables?
Sure. So as far as that, energy going up, now we're going to start talking about rates, so the mood's going to go kind of the opposite direction. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing double-digit annual rate increases out of the three major IOUs. We've just got involved in the PacifiCorp general rate case, and that's looking at a 27% increase across the board. And so, these rates are the kind of general players of transmission costs. You're looking at some of the wildfire mitigation is really what's driving a lot of the new impacts. And so you're seeing what, hundreds of millions is now turning into billions on billions of increases. And then with that, you're adding in these other electrification components. So now we're pushing for the EV charging infrastructure, and we're doing, they're asking for building electrification in Edison, which is another $670 million. And so those are only going to continue to kind of push rates upward. And there's just not really a good sign that those things are going to go down. The PUC does their kind of annual rate impact report, and it tends to be more residential focused, but where that was headed, in 2019 and 2020, those 2035 numbers are now pushed down to 2030, and we're just kind of seeing that increase just go up and up and up. And so, you're looking at these increases, but it's good for the utilities. As your infrastructure projects, you get a rate of return, so they're not going to turn down any of these. Some of them are legislative mandated goals of electrification, because that's a new project that we get to build and that we get to pass on that cost to ratepayers. And so, at least for ag, you're kind of stuck in this spot of, we're a price taker. We can't just pass that cost on. So you kind of have to try and eat that cost and figure out where, you can make a difference. But then we have the net energy metering. Tariff is up at the PUC right now, and so it's hard to say what the actual impact will be. But, it's not looking great, and it's not going to make, I don't think it's going to make solar that much more attractive for non-residential customers. And then, the other scary thing is they were kind of talking about what they might do with the payback period. And, this was a promise essentially that the PUC made to customers, and now they may go back on that. And so I think there's just a lot of uncertainty on, I can't get out from the rates that I'm being provided, so how do I self-generate or make a difference, and you're not really given that certainty or in that structure, and so you're kind of stuck between, I guess, a rock and a hard place.
Great, yeah, and this is a lot of technical stuff, getting pretty outside of agriculture here, so PUC, Public Utilities Commission, net energy metering, I'm actually going to bounce that over to Michael, because I know you can answer that too.
Yeah, with agriculture, we love renewable energy. We're doing a lot of it on our farms, and that's a great thing. And I encourage others to do that to the degree you can take control of your own destiny and do renewable energy. Because if you're going to buy it from the utility, as Kevin just said, it's really, really expensive. And unfortunately, it's going to continue to get even more expensive. We've seen, California with rates easily now that are more than double the national average rates. And they're soon going to be triple for all the reasons Kevin just stated. And so really important that we try to control our own destiny. And we're seeing a lot of solar installed on farms. We're seeing dairies develop a lot of renewable energy. The idea that we can take dairy manure, dairy waste, and turn it into renewable electricity for charging BMWs. We're taking dairy waste and turning it into renewable natural gas for use in heavy-duty trucks, and not just reducing methane from dairies, but we're cleaning the air in the San Joaquin Valley and the South Coast. So these are all wonderful things, but they do come with a price tag, and we're starting to feel that. And I think for food processors and others, we're not going to just feel it on the electricity side. We're going to start to feel it on the natural gas side as well. We're starting to see that. We saw natural gas rates go up quite a bit in the last 12 months. They've almost doubled in terms of the commodity cost. And we're going to continue to see that as the utilities decarbonize their pipelines. They want to add a lot of expensive renewable natural gas. They want to add a lot of hydrogen to the pipelines, which is going to come at a huge, huge cost to food processors, fiber processors in the state. So we should all be concerned as we go forward.
And Julie, and can you give a little bit more background than the brief introduction I gave you as well?
Yeah, I represent the California Biomass Energy Alliance here in Sacramento, and CBEA is the trade association of the state's woody biomass power producers. These are primarily the utility scale biomass power producers. Of course, there are several of them in the Central Valley and around that take, wood waste, generate renewable electricity. I would like to add, the only thing I'd like to add actually is that if you're taking utility power, what we know from the SB 100 report, which is the report that the joint agencies did a couple years ago, on how we reach our carbon and renewable goals, the report made very clear that you're going to get the most cost savings by diverse portfolios. So what is good from an ag perspective is the fact that you need biomass, you need biogas, you need other forms of electricity in their portfolios to sort of maintain the cost from going up even higher. So when they did different scenarios and say cut out all combustion technologies, which would have removed every single bioenergy facility, in the state, prices went up. So just keep in mind that a diverse portfolio from your utilities is what's going to keep, at least prices from skyrocketing.
Sure, great. And when we're talking about dairy digesters, when we're talking about biomass, all these renewable energy options, these were the exciting thing, years ago in Sacramento. This was what everybody was really rallying behind. The conversation has been changing, and I wanted to ask you, Julie, I'll start with you over there. Are environmental justice goals changing the conversation when we're talking about biomass in Sacramento?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the environmental justice community, of course, is concerned about emissions that are impacting their communities. So if you have a facility that's in the community, they're really not interested in hearing about the emissions reductions for the region. They really don't want that stack in their neighborhood. And so that we totally get. Where we're getting caught up is that there's no conversation going on about mitigation. It's either that stack shouldn't be there, period. And then that's sort of the end of the conversation. And I think when they come to Sacramento, they get legislators hearing them, but here they do also want to talk about, well, how can we solve the problem? Because just making these facilities go away isn't the answer either. And that's where we end up sort of with a roadblock. And some legislators and policymakers, aren't listening as much anymore when their answer is, well, we just really want it to go away. So yes, they're impacting it, but I think the more they don't come to the table with mitigation measures, the harder it is, for folks to listen and take that seriously.
And for you, Michael?
Would agree. We see it with the dairy sector here in California, whether it's at the Air Resources Board, the California Public Utilities Commission, the Energy Commission, and the legislature. They are actively lobbying to exclude dairy from any definition of renewable energy. And, as I've said before, I've been in this space for about 30 years, and the idea that taking dairy manure and turning it into renewable electricity that we can power BMWs, or turning it into carbon negative transportation fuel. If that's not renewable, I'm missing something. But again, I think Julie's correct. It is falling a little bit on deaf ears, but they're very active. They're very engaged in the process. They have platforms that, frankly, we don't have. They have the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, the EJAC committee as it's known, at the Air Resources Board. And a few years ago, the legislature created similar platforms for the EJ community at the Public Utilities Commission and the Energy Commission. They have their own Disadvantaged Community Advisory Committee, or advisory group, DACAG, I think it's called. And so they've got a platform that we don't have, which means we just need to be much more proactive.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do our best to try and support, biomass in every proceeding that we can because, yeah, like you said, they come out of the woodwork to beat them up. But, we've always kind of harped on the idea of it's a waste management tool. I mean, we're getting this added benefit of managing waste plus energy. It's hard for me to see where that's not a plus. And we're banning pile and burn, and so where are these, materials supposed to go? I think we've always tried our best to kind of support biomass where we can because it does just take hits from everywhere. And like I said, it's just befuddling at times of why this isn't, as Michael said, if that's not renewable, I don't know what is.
You touched on something there that's kind of a whole other conversation here to be had. And Julie, I'm going to bring this to you. How is the state's ban on open agricultural burning in the San Joaquin Valley impacting fuels for biomass plants?
Yeah, I mean, the bioenergy facilities that are in the Central Valley primarily, always said, we're here. So whatever the state of California or the local air districts want to do, we're here to help manage that material. And we've been doing this now for 30 plus years. And it's gone up and down over the years. But, more recently, the state of California is stepping up to help growers, to manage that waste. There's just simply aren't enough biomass plants to take everything. It does cost a little extra money, a lot extra maybe sometimes. But what we're seeing is actually less biomass material, less ag waste coming out of the fields to the facilities because the state and the feds are actually putting more money into reincorporation, and more growers are taking advantage of that. So what we're doing recently is hearing from our fuel buyers that they can't bring us as much material as they used to because growers are choosing to get that incentive and reincorporate. So I think we need to maybe work to bring back that balance of reincorporation, getting it to the facilities, and figure out what it's going to take to continue to fuel the facilities and reincorporate and whatever it is to manage that material. So right now I think we're sort of in a hiccup on that. And we definitely want to work with the growers and figure out how we can do both, manage the waste.
Yeah, and Michael, can you explain this a little bit? And is there a difference in how wood is being chipped today to meet these goals?
Yeah, and this is just something that's come to my attention. I know Julie was going to explore it with her folks, but yeah, how you chip or shred the wood for incorporation may be different than the wood chips that we would need for a biomass plant, or even some of the dairy manure methane projects that we're looking at that use wood chips along with worms to denitrify some of the wastewater coming from dairy. So we're learning a lot and trying to better understand that, but there are some subtle changes that have been occurring just as the use of these materials changes.
Great, very interesting. Let's shift gears here a little bit. And Kevin, I'm going to come back to you here. We talked earlier in a previous panel about how Cal OSHA recently or the Standards Board for Cal OSHA, I should say, the board that governs the agency, recently rejected a petition on autonomous tractors. Does this conflict with the state's electrification goals?
Well, I think it doesn't help. I mean, you're trying to, agricultural members, and the more I've gotten to meet our members and get to know them, they're very intelligent people. They're kind of on the cutting edge of a lot of these technologies. They're trying to do the most efficient things, with the least amount of either energy input or whatever resource they're using. And so I think to have this technological advance and then to kind of stunt it by requiring, a passenger in the vehicle, it kind of sends the wrong message of where are we going with some of these advancements if we're then going to handcuff them as they come out. So I think there's a lot of interesting and exciting technology that's going to come along with kind of the electrification of everything. But it's kind of the same issue we run into if they want us to electrify our fleets, but then it takes 12 to 18 months, on a good day to get an interconnection, and we're hearing sometimes 2 years. And so how am I supposed to electrify my fleet if I can't then get the proper stations to do the charging? So I do think there's sometimes kind of conflicting methods or messages of how do you want me to proceed with making things, more renewable, electrifying, but then I also have to, take a step back in how far I can advance with technology.
Great. Michael, you're nodding your head over there.
Yeah, we're seeing the same thing, not on the autonomous issue, but just generally with heavy-duty freight, heavy-duty trucking in the state, where we've got renewable natural gas that's available today, can dramatically improve air quality in the San Joaquin Valley, but the state is pushing more towards electricity and hydrogen. They want zero-emission vehicles, not low-emission vehicles. And it's frustrating and it's difficult because these trucking companies only want to make one transition if they have to make a transition. And if they go to renewable natural gas, they're likely going to have to either go to hydrogen or electricity at some point in the not too distant future. So it makes some of that decision making and decisions about infrastructure hard. And then you throw in the point Kevin just made about interconnection, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. It's a big issue. I'm working on siting a new plant in the San Joaquin Valley for a client, and one of the biggest constraints is PG&E's system just can't support 12 or 14 megawatts that they might need to put a new food processing plant in the San Joaquin Valley, not without massive upgrades. And it's debilitating, but it was mentioned earlier by one of the speakers. Reliability is going to be a big issue, particularly as we go down this path of electrifying everything in the state.
Is this inhibiting some interest in investing in some of these multi-million-dollar dairy digesters, renewable RNG projects?
Well, right now, the big issue with investment in dairy digesters is probably more related to the fact that the low-carbon fuel standard price has come down so dramatically over the last 6 to 9 months last year, and concern that it may stay low. That's going to have an impact not just here in California, but across the country, because they benefit from the LCFS. So it does have an impact. Interconnections have an impact. Even if we're doing a renewable natural gas project, we still need an interconnection at the point where we clean and condition the gas, because that takes electricity to clean and condition the dairy biogas into pipeline biomethane. So it has an impact, and PG&E is just very, very slow, and Edison not much better.
Great, yeah. A lot of talk about PG&E, the four-letter word coming up here. So just kind of a question for everybody. What have been the challenges? Can you give us a little bit of an overview of how far we've come with PG&E and energy rates? What can we expect next? Let's focus on what's next, actually.
Kevin and I just sat through a recent 2-hour presentation from PG&E about all that they're doing from climate. And never once did the issue of rates come up in that discussion. It's look at all the wonderful things we're doing. We're trying to remake ourselves, and I no doubt that they're trying to do that, and and they need to do that. But absolutely no concern that I heard whatsoever about rates, and it's just different. Think about it for a second. If you were allowed to get every dollar you invested for climate smart agriculture, if you were able to get an 11% return on that investment and know that every penny of it's going to get paid back, guaranteed, we'd all be making huge investments on our farms. Well, guess what, folks? That's the deal PG&E and Edison and the other investor-owned utilities have. So when they tell us they're doing all this wonderful climate, smart electricity stuff, it's great, but it's an easy decision for them. They're actually going to make money on it. And unfortunately, that's a little bit of the perverse incentive that we have with the investor-owned utilities in California. Probably not going to change, so we're kind of stuck with it. But rates are going to just continue to increase. PG&E's undergrounding 10,000 miles of transmission line. They've started on that process. Well, guess what? That's going to cost $20 to $30 billion, and that's all going to get wrapped into rates over the next few years as they make those investments. So rates are going one direction, unfortunately, and that's up. There's nothing that's going to bring them down, even though the cost of solar and the cost of some of the other technologies have come down.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd add is 20 to 30 billion is probably a conservative estimate from what some folks have said. And yeah, I think what we heard in that same presentation was that instead of the California goal of net zero of 2045, that PG&E was going to get there by 2040. And this isn't a product of, wow, we're just so ahead on everything and it's so much cheaper than we thought, so let's just keep going and pushing forward. It's just we have ratepayers that'll fund it if we keep building these projects or initiating these projects. So why not shoot for a new goal so that we can just, and it's not like when 2040 hits that those projects will stop and those rates will kind of smooth back out. It's kind of just this constant push, and let's just keep layering and layering and layering. And so, yeah, it's very frightening.
So what have you been advising your members as when it comes to just a general rate increases? Are you telling them to leave California?
Well, I mean, that's always the thing that's interesting is, that becomes the pitch for some other groups as well. If you keep raising our rates, we're going to leave, but we can't leave. This is where we grow our commodities. You can't grow some of these commodities in other places. This is where we farm. This is where we do our business. And so we have to do our best job as advocates to point out the flaws, to fight against some of these increases and try our best to, mitigate some of the impacts. And then, which is a tough goal because I don't think the commission always understands what these time of use periods mean for agriculture and how we actually use our energy for irrigation. And so it's kind of this constant battle of trying to defend against these increases, to educate on how we actually use energy, and then some level of, trying to see what we can do to become a little more self-reliant or self-sufficient with, wind or solar or whatever kind of works. But yeah, I mean, at times it feels like a losing battle to try and fight off, 19%, I think, was the ag rate increase in the PG&E Phase 1 case. I mean, even if you can do your best to mitigate it, it's still, maybe 10%. And so it's a constant fight, and I think we just have to, but that's the beauty of ag is I think agricultural members then find a way, right? They find a way to do more with less, but that's not what we should constantly be asking them to do.
Yeah, we're clearly going to hit a tipping point. We're seeing it. Smithfield announced that they're pulling out of Southern California recently and taking over 1,000 good jobs with them, and I think we're going to start to see that in other industries that aren't stuck here in California. The dairy sector is one of those, and we are seeing a shift of where dairy production is going in this country. It's no longer on the coasts. It's moving towards the Midwest and the Plain States, and that's going to continue. Dairy consumption is on the increase per capita, has been just about every year for the past 70. That's going to continue, but the production's going to shift from California and the East Coast more to the Midwest. At least the growth in consumption is going to be going to Texas, Idaho, and some of the other Kansas and some of the other states where we're building big new cheese plants because guess what? Cheese has a nice long shelf life. It's not fluid milk. It doesn't have to be close to where the consumption is.
Very interesting. So what are you advising for on the food processor side when this is a huge energy consumer?
Do your best to get off the grid on the electricity side. On the natural gas side, it's a lot more difficult because the solutions like renewable natural gas, and I'm a huge fan of renewable natural gas coming from the dairy sector, it's very expensive. It's 5 to 10 times as expensive as conventional fossil gas. Hydrogen, the other alternative, is even more expensive right now. There's some hope that that will come down. Not much hope that renewable natural gas has really got any economy of scale that's going to bring it down in terms of cost. So what are the solutions for heat in our food processing and fiber processing facilities? That's a much more difficult issue for us to solve. It may be continuing to use fossil fuels and capturing the carbon coming out of the stack and sequestering it permanently and underground.
And just sticking on this topic of high energy rates, always a lot more to talk about. Michael, I want to pitch this to you, but anybody can answer here. How is this impacting water and water rates?
Water in California is always, I don't want to say it's free, but it's essentially free. It's the cost of moving, and in the urban sector, the cost of treating water, and it gets more expensive. The deeper you pump groundwater, the more expensive it gets. And so we've continued to see that. And because we have less surface water and we've been using more groundwater, energy bills have gone up substantially, not just rates, but because we're using more electricity. And even as we go to energy conservation, drip systems tend to use a little bit more than furrow irrigation because they're having to pressurize the system, so it takes energy to do that. So it's difficult, but it definitely is driving the cost of water.
Great. And Julie, I want to bring you back into this now. How has the view of bioenergy been changing in Sacramento? This has been a long discussion. We're talking about some huge issues when you're talking about forest debris and ag waste in general. How has it changed? What's this conversation like today?
Yeah, I'd say that starting with the tree mortality crisis during the last drought, and which eventually turned itself into a wildfire crisis, the conversation about bioenergy, taking forest waste to generate renewable electricity, has changed quite a bit. It used to be, we were just another renewable that no one mentioned in their press releases. Don't forget, renewable wind and solar. And that's really not the case anymore. They want to make sure, the state of California, policymakers wants to make sure that the facilities that we have online today stay online because they know that material needs to come out of the forest. It just can't sit there. So California is actually really lucky from a West Coast perspective, fire severity areas, that we actually have infrastructure in this state already in place that could take this material. So, the state of California set up a program called the BioRAM program, BioRAM, R-A-M, and that is telling the state's largest utilities that they have to procure this power for facilities that are committed to take high percentages of high priority forest waste. So I actually have a bill going through the legislature right now, SB 1109 by Senator Caballero, that's asking for 5 more years in the program so we can ensure that the infrastructure that California is so lucky and rich to have stays online.
Do you think we'll be building any new biomass plants here in the coming years to accommodate this greater need?
We have actually a number of existing idled plants that currently aren't operating. You don't need to build another biomass plant, a utility scale biomass plant. I'm talking community scale, I'm talking utility scale. You don't have to, because I've got about 10 of them, 100, 150 megawatts that can go online with the simple signing of a contract. So if anyone has a contract with a utility that we can get our hands on, we can get more biomass facilities online and taking ag waste, forest waste, urban wood waste.
Great, thanks. Okay, switching over to our Slido questions from the audience here. We have a few of them coming in. I'll start with this one. Is there any discussion about encouraging dual-use solar where you could still have livestock or cropping under the solar panels?
I just started to read a little bit about dual-use solar. I'm not quite sure how it fits into, certainly not going to work with almond trees in the San Joaquin Valley. Or probably a corn crop on a dairy, but it's interesting, and most of our livestock already have barns for shade. So I guess in some of the open corrals there might be some opportunity to build some shade structures with solar on top, but I just haven't seen a good application of it for California yet.
Yeah, I think the same. I've heard of it as a concept, but I haven't really seen as much of it in practice. So I guess it's there as an option, but I think we're always trying to be very conscious too of not taking prime ag land and using it for solar. So that's always something that we're very adamant about, that, you know, where this solar is sited is very important. And so it needs to be on non-productive land, and, you know, some of these larger projects, let's look towards the desert. Let's not keep using ag land because it's close and we can see it, and hey, it looks kind of flat. You know, I think, so as far as the dual use, I'm sure there are applications, but I've seen it more in theory and concept rather than in practice.
Okay, great. And Julie, I'm going to throw this question to you. In the town of Paradise, we are trying to get rid of burnt trees. Do you have any suggestions?
So, you know, biomass facility, half of the, you know, budget of a biomass facility is actually fuel costs. So a facility goes out and tries to get material that was within a reasonable distance, that fits within its, you know, contract, its power purchase agreement with the utility. If you're outside of that distance, there needs to be some subsidies for that. Now, I'm not saying that Paradise is within that distance of, she mentioned Willabrator, but what I would do is actually, I would really encourage some support for the state of California's request, or the governor actually has a request of the legislature in the budget to put money into biomass transportation subsidies. So if one of my facilities has its budget and has its contracts and has a full fuel yard or whatever that is and can't take your material, if there was another entity out there, government entity, whether it's the state of California or the federal government, who can actually cover those transportation costs so that material is coming for free to the facility, that they're not paying extra out of their fuel budget, they would take that in a second. So I think we all need to be supporting the biomass transportation subsidy, you know, that the governor's proposed in the budget. I know that federal government is proposing something similar, but if that person wants to leave their contact information, I actually will see what I can do to help.
Okay, great. Well said. We got some other questions here. Switching back to solar, I believe, and maybe you guys can educate me on this. What do you think about agrivoltaics?
I mean, maybe it's the afternoon. I haven't had my, you know, third cup of coffee. I'm kind of dense on what the agrivoltaics definition includes. So if you have the Michael, and it sounds like. So I'm not sure I can actually accurately answer the question without fully knowing what that entails. I mean, if we're talking about, you know, electrification on the farm and sort of that kind of feedback loop of getting renewables with, you know, electric tractors and kind of that system, I mean, that's in place, and I think we're starting to head towards that and working on, I know some companies are working on the technology and the programming side of that to kind of get you into this system of using when it's least expensive and recharging when it's, you know, least and stuff, but that probably doesn't answer the question since I don't know the definition.
Okay, I'm going to jump back to rates again. So with the rising energy rates, is this prohibiting farmers from investing in some climate-friendly practices or technologies when we're talking about climate-smart agriculture?
It's certainly a consideration when, you know, if you're going to electrify a feed mixing operation on a dairy. It's a consideration. You know, electricity is getting more expensive. Now, thankfully, a lot of our dairies have done the right thing, and they put in solar panels on their farms and are serving their own, you know, use and doing it cheaply. And, you know, I haven't met a dairy farmer yet that regrets the decision to put in a 1 to 2 megawatt solar system on his dairy farm. They all think that's been a great return on the investment. As Kevin said, we need to continue to protect that at the Public Utilities Commission, so that remains an option. So, you know, it can be a consideration. It can be limiting at some point. We are going to, as I said, hit a tipping point with energy rates, and it's going to be harder and harder to electrify things. You know, when you're comparing it to, you know, $7 diesel and $6 gasoline, it's still probably a little less expensive, but not for long.
Julie, do you have anything to add to that for plants who are looking to invest in some new technologies that might be a little bit better for the environment, but the costs are just prohibitive?
Yeah, in fact, many of the facilities, existing facilities, are doing their own analysis of what it would take to, say, convert the facility to gasification, so still taking wood waste, producing a different product. Carbon capture and storage, these are all very expensive technologies, but, you know, the state and the feds are, you know, putting out R&D grant programs to help, you know, ease that cost. I know PG&E has actually been very interested in partnering with some of our facilities to do both the gasification conversion issue. You know, we kind of need to do it, right? You know, we need to think beyond, you know, where we are today. Some facilities will still always be that exact technology because it's what works best for its company and for the region where it's located, the community and the material that it's taking. But some are really going to bust out of that mold and do something, you know, pretty spectacular to keep the facility on for 30 more years. So yeah, we're definitely looking into it. It's just not going to be cheap.
Great. I've noticed so much discussion going on around carbon capture. It's very heated discussion in the Capitol these days. A lot of activity around that.
But we need to do it. You know, we just can't sit there and look at what's a better technology. Do you have a better technology? We need to be looking at all of the above and put all our brain power together and figure out, you know, what are those technologies that'll get us to our carbon goals.
All right, we've got an audience question here. It kind of gets us into some other energy. This is a concern that's actually come up with Senator Caballero before when we're talking about hydropower. And the question is, why does California buy renewable energy from out-of-state producers, which give nothing back to Californians who pay premium price without local environmental and job benefits?
Well, one reason is to keep the lights on, and you know, we do need regional cooperation. We're going to need a lot of it this summer. You know, a few years ago when the lights went out, it was because, you know, that heat event that we were having, it was not just happening here in California, but it was happening across the West. And so the inability of California to be able to import sufficient power, you know, a lot of that renewable energy from the Pacific Northwest, the hydro Pacific Northwest, is actually very inexpensive for us to be able to import. Flip side of that is, you know, I'll talk all day about why we're allowing out-of-state projects to benefit from the low carbon fuel standard, because that's one that is directly impacting California consumers at the gas pump. And I recognize we want to help the rest of the country figure out how to do these things, and I'm a big believer in showing them, but when it comes to paying for them, I start to question that a little bit. And so that's one of the areas I know we're starting to, in the dairy sector here in California, is starting to question whether or not it makes sense to, you know, be paying for a lot of these out-of-state projects, you know, that are bringing renewable gas into California under the low carbon fuel standard.
Did I mention I have 10 idle facilities in the state that need contracts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short and sweet is that we buy it because we need it, but you know, that is the troubling thing, and I think we're seeing is like Michael said, was the West-wide experiences a warming event in the other states get a little less willing to, you know, kind of send us their power. Then what happens? So I think that has become more of a conversation lately of not necessarily shutting us off, but weaning us off maybe, or slowing the tap a little bit.
Okay, great. I'm going to try to wrap it up here with basically a blank check question. If you can get California to change one policy, what would that be? Julie.
Oh, thank you for asking.
You look very excited about that.
Yeah, you know, did I mention the 10 idle biomass facilities? All it takes is a contract to get the facilities up and running. It's renewable because the fuel is out there. The wood waste from the forest, from the ag sector, from the urban sector, landfill diversion, the fuel is out there. If I could do one thing, I would take that BioRAM program, which requires utilities procure biomass power focused on forest material. I would expand that, expand it to ag. I would say that the utilities need to buy more megawatts than they're buying right now, and they have a separate siloed ag fuel requirement. That's what I would do. That would make sure that the facilities that we have online today stay online long into the future.
And I never thought I would say this, but I have become a huge fan. I'm a free market thinker. My background's in economics. And I have become a huge fan of municipal utilities here in California because they do it cheaper, they do it more effectively than the investor-owned utilities. And so if I could change one thing, I think it would be to get rid of that perverse incentive that the investor-owned utilities have. They will always put shareholder interests above the interests of ratepayers, plain and simple. And municipal utilities and their governing boards simply do not have that conflict. And so they tend to do it cheaper, they tend to do it better than the investor-owned utilities, and PG&E is probably the best example of why it falls apart. I mean, their system is falling apart because they gave all those profits to shareholders rather than reinvesting in their system. And a municipal utility simply does not have that conflict.
I think there's a couple, but probably to stop putting states' initiatives on ratepayers. So we ask the IOUs to go out and build these projects, and we treat ratepayers, as Michael said in settings before, as a piggy bank. And so we've gained a little bit of traction, I think, in some of the smaller legislation to say, go look for federal funding, go look for state funding, look elsewhere besides ratepayers. So I think some form of having these initiatives stop going directly to ratepayers first, and maybe if we can't pay for them, then we shouldn't proceed with them until we can. But this treatment of ratepayers is kind of a blank check for whatever the cause du jour is, I think is not the right way to go about it. So some way to get away from that incentive of just putting things on the back of ratepayers.
I should have asked for two. What is your second one?
Oh, I think it'd be nice to have a holiday, both personally and from some of the initiatives that we're dealing with. We're pretty far behind this year, I think, on the renewable projects because of some of the solar disruption with getting the panels into the state. So, I think we just push ahead. We just say, let's add a little more, and 27 looks bad. Let's just keep doling out the projects. And so I think to have maybe a little bit of a pause on some of these projects until we get a few things completed would be the second choice.
Any other number twos?
I'll just say the state needs to put a much bigger focus on the transmission planning than what we've done historically here in California. You're going to hear a lot about this in the next few years because as we continue to electrify, transmission grid is going to be the big limiting factor. And believe me, I've worked for a couple of transmission companies trying to site projects here in California. You do not build these projects quickly or easily, particularly in a state like this. So we're going to all regret the fact that the state has really kind of dropped the ball on transmission planning over the course of the next decade.
Yeah, I was going to add transmission planning as well. You're not going to be able to build anything new, more advanced, whatever it is, without the capacity to do so.
Great, well said. I think that brings us pretty much to a close here, and I want to thank our panelists here for a very interesting conversation.